Welcome to our episode for August 24th. It's early in the morning and we're here to talk about some important optimal work topics. Kevin, how's it going?
Doing well, Sharif. How have you been?
Awesome. I've been doing great, learning a lot the past couple weeks, and so ready to talk optimal work.
Wonderful. We have a kind of new thing today, don't we?
Yes. So, well, you just found this article. I don't know how you found it, on Fast Company. Harvard researchers discover the easy behavioral trick to avoiding depression on fastcompany.com.
Exactly. That's how they sell it. It was actually in the American Journal of Psychiatry, and the title there is An Exposure-Wide and Mendelian Randomization Approach to Identifying Modifiable Factors for the Prevention of Depression. So it doesn't roll off the tongue the same way that the Fast Company does. But I thought Fast Company actually had exactly. But they actually had one of the best summaries of the article. Mm-hmm. But this was a big deal, this article.
Okay, so why? Well, I mean, maybe we start summarizing it or.
Yeah, it's a study of like over 123,000 people.
Right.
In a database, looking at the things that they do, what they're called, modifiable factors for depression, which is basically behaviors you can change, because genetics and early life trauma are not modifiable. So they're saying basically these are the two things that we're kind of not treating as modifiable. And instead, they looked at like over 100 other behaviors that people have some control over. And then tried to see how these relate to depression. And I think that the results fit perfectly with how we approach things in optimal work and the understanding that we have of how even depression works.
So what were their main findings then in terms of what you can, or what behaviors increase depression or what behaviors you can take to decrease?
So the two big things, and in this kind of study, you really do want to get what's the final thing after you've done all of this sensitive, like making sure that you're not over interpreting results, and that the authors do a fantastic job of Carmel and company do a fantastic job trying to see what are the big things you can take away from this.
Yeah.
And the two behaviors that seem to be most associated with depression are watching a lot of TV and taking naps in the daytime. So I have been always, trying to encourage people, to avoid the daytime nap.
Yeah.
And then also to be limiting in some way, TV consumption. And then the one behavior that really stood out as being protective or preventive, actually, for depression is socializing, namely confiding in others.
Right. Sincerity.
Yeah, sincerity.
And that's like a sign of close connection, right? It's not just lots of superficial relationships, but
precisely
real deep friendships.
Yep. That to have people you can be sincere with. I don't believe that it's simply because these are people you can complain to, but these are people that can help you put things in context. So that you don't get over focused on any problem, but you see the bigger picture in life, and that you have these meaningful relationships. Also, in general, time spent with family and friends, which was a different variable, also, did show results. That this is one of these things preventive. Just as a side note, the strangest risk factor that they found?
Multivitamins.
Exactly, taking multivitamins.
Yeah.
So, but then you get into these funny things where, maybe people who are getting depressed are kind of grasping for solutions. Yeah. And so they start taking things to supplement to get more energy.
So it's not really causation. It's just, it's actually,
or you can have reverse causation. So where, like, for instance, with daytime naps, they do show reverse causation. So which is that you have, on the one hand, the habit of taking naps seems to increase, in a real substantial way, the risk of getting depressed. But also depression makes people more likely to take naps. So it's bidirectional.
Right.
But what they're trying to do, and the way they structure the study, is be able to tease that kind of information out.
Mm-hmm.
But people who are getting depressed are not thereby more likely to socialize. So, and socializing, so there's no reverse causation there in the new direction. So people who, you could say that, and people who are socializing more, even if they have risk factors for depression, are less likely to get depressed. So interesting stuff.
Yeah. Okay. One thing that two things I thought might be missing from it. So I wanted to run these by you, and obviously you've treated depression in a clinical setting, so you might have kind of insight into this. So one is, okay, what about the effect of work? I mean, we might say that we would maybe want to say that, okay, if you can work well, you're kind of treating depression through that. So I don't, maybe that's totally off.
Yeah. So, and this is the kind of study that this is looking at essentially broad picture lifetime type behaviors and traits in 120,000+ people. Mm-hmm. So and the authors say specifically, this is not something where you can assess any treatment that has a short time scale. So that you can have a treatment that works really well, but it's not going to show up in this kind of huge population study, which is just on a database of people and where they also catalog their habits. And then you're assessing this gigantic UK database. So we don't know, and especially because you'd be thinking like a clinician, I think, what's the effect of changing your approach to work on depression? I think it's huge. Yeah. So, but this kind of study wouldn't have any hints in that direction. It's just not, it's a population study.
Okay. And then my second question is, it seems also like depression might be linked with, and maybe we can get into this a little bit later, is like, I think there's a kind of colloquial notion of what depression is, and then maybe a more technical description of it. But my sense is that it's about like lacking meaning or purpose in life. So do they have any sense of like, kind of having answers to the why questions, or what's it all, and it seems like lacking that, you might have increased depression, but having a strong sense of meaning and purpose would tend to decrease depression, but they're not getting into that either.
Yeah, exactly. And this kind of study, for instance, with religious affiliation or practice, who knows, sometimes you can have someone who has all the right ideals and isn't living them at all.
Yeah.
But then, and so they actually feel worse. They feel more guilt. Now, are they going to be at increased risk of depression because they're not living according to their ideals? I think so. Mm-hmm. But on this kind of assessment, they're going to show up as a religious person. So you just don't. It's hard on these giant population studies.
Yeah.
When something could go either way. Mm-hmm. It's even exercise, because sometimes people who are depressed try exercising more as an initial treatment, and it does work. But if you assess it at the wrong time, it looks like, ooh, people who are exercising a lot are more depressed. No, it's that actually this is working and they know it works. It's like people who go to psychotherapy more often. Well, yeah, they're going to have more problems. Is it because of psychotherapy? No, they're actually going to psychotherapy. Well, if it's good psychotherapy, they're actually getting better, and that's why they're going, because they have problems. And so the timing on these kind of studies is tricky. There's ample evidence, though, that sources of meaning are super important. Mm-hmm. So, and the practice of religion, the practice of gratitude, and, having, and the more frequent religious practice is more protective. There's really ample stuff. This study wasn't really designed to assess that kind of question.
Okay.
But I do think that, Viktor Frankl talked about a no-logical depression, which, instead of like a biological, it's no-logical, which means that it's because of a lack of meaning, a lack of nous. So a kind of sense of mind. And, and so he thought that, if people don't have meaning, they get this kind of existential depression. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of, that's not in general what psychiatrists think of as depression. What the psychiatrists think of as depression has more physical type symptoms. You have a depressed mood, but then you also have a sleep disturbance, and you're uninterested in things, and you feel low energy, and your concentration is off, and your movement is slower, your thoughts are slower, appetites are disturbed, increased, hunger, decreased hunger. So we tend to think of it more as like the, having those symptoms present 5 or more, for something like 2 weeks, that constitutes an episode of major depression.
Okay. How many people have experienced that, like that sort of depression? What percent?
That's a good question. I think in the general estimates, it's around 10%. People say that they've had a significant level of depression, but it seems that in like the WHO studies, the depression is the #1 cause worldwide of people having disability. So that it is a very common cause of disability, and so, but if you have, you can have 30 million people with depression at any time in the US, there's, or at least to some degree.
Okay. So it occurs along a kind of continuum.
Yeah. And the concern about, what we're going through right now is that if socializing, confiding in others, spending meaningful time with family and friends, is the best thing you can do to not get depressed, then what's the effect going to be of these lockdowns and social distancing? That we are concerned that we're going to be facing, real increased rates of depression. And then the big concern is that leads to an increased risk of suicide, which, then obviously that's why everyone gets concerned about depression, is that, it has a clear association with the suicide risk. If people are feeling suicidal, they need professional help right away. And if they say things like that to their family members have to take it very seriously, but especially in these times, actually, that I think there is an increased risk now for it. So just
and
a
it's
public service announcement, take it seriously, always.
Right. And so it's interesting that with the lockdown, kind of the article pinpoints 3 factors. Confiding in others reduces rate of depression. That's going to be harder with the lockdown.
Yep.
TV and napping increase rates of depression. Those are much easier with the lockdown.
Exactly.
Or easier to just kind of
exactly. So it's like the perfect trifecta for badness when it comes to depression. The triple whammy.
Do you get the sense that these 3, I mean, I'm not sure how much the article gets into it, are they meant to be a full explanation, or do they talk about kind of what percentage of depression these factors account for? So, I mean, these are the factors that they found are most kind of important in causing depression.
Yeah.
Are they responsible for 70% of it or 20%?
No, it doesn't go into such detail, but assigning the actual, how much are they responsible for it?
Right.
But I think that we can, what's talked about in psychiatry as kind of major depression, I think is the end result of a long process of a vicious cycle. And at that point, it does get very tough to treat, but still, the #1 treatment for depression in terms of psychotherapy is called behavioral activation therapy. So behavioral activation is you get people increasingly active, and you just think about and I've done this with severely depressed people. Okay, what's one thing they could do once a day? And then what's one thing they can do in the morning? And what's one thing they can do in the afternoon? And you just keep on increasing the level of activity. I think that the best way of summarizing depression from a cognitive behavioral standpoint is it's like a phobia of being depleted of energy. So people have this fear of exhaustion, a fear of tiredness. So what do you do if you're afraid of being tired? Well, you constantly monitor it. You take naps. You watch more TV because it doesn't require energy. You basically avoid anything that requires energy so that you can conserve what energy you have. That is the vicious cycle of depression. It's called the lethargy cycle. You feel you don't have energy, you're monitoring it, and then you hold back on doing things that take energy, but then you feel less and less energetic. Because being around other people, particularly if you're starting to get depressed, is super important because you get energized by it. Does it take energy? Yes, but it gives you more energy. Same with exercise. Does exercise take energy? Yes, but it gives you back more energy. So the depressed person becomes unwilling, as they get more depressed, to expend energy in order to get energy back. But that's the only way to get energy back, is to be willing to invest it and spend it. So paradoxically, it's like exposure therapy for depression is actually aiming for exhaustion. Now, I'm talking about when people are actually in the vicious cycle of avoiding anything that takes energy. I'm not saying that the whole population should aim to exhaust itself, but when you're getting that phobia, then you're going to actually feel kind of scared of getting tired. And people get this kind of fantasy in their mind. And I've asked them, like, do you think at some point you're just going to run out of energy and then like end up lying on the sidewalk? Like, have you ever seen that happen? Or someone just like, they're just literally lying because they just ran out of energy. And people laugh and they're like, no, but they really do develop a phobia of it.
But it's like you act as if that's going to happen.
Like it's a real risk.
Yeah.
And then they don't leave the house, and then they stop seeing people. They stop going to work or classes with their students, and they do less and less. And that's a really dangerous thing because they end up with less and less energy. Also, sleeping too much leads to increased risk of worsening depression because of the effects, it seems, of REM. Too much REM overdosing, by having too much sleep makes depression worse. And I've had people sleeping 14 hours a day and living in a dream world because most of that time was spent eventually in REM, and their dreams are more vivid than their life. And so they feel like their life got flipped inside out, but now they're just in their dreams, and the real life is more like a boring dream.
Wow. Especially if it's inactive,
Yeah, exactly. And so they're like, their ordinary life is just, staying in their house. And so it's so I think that in general, aiming to spend energy on relationships, on work, on exercise, for the vast majority of people is what they need for depression. Mm-hmm. There can be other cases where, for instance, if someone has bipolar disorder, where bipolar disorder, the depression people get there, I don't even think of that as a psychological issue. It's like a physical issue, that they actually have cycles of energy levels, and so in that case, we have excellent medicines that work to treat the depression, which is why if someone is really struggling with depression, they need a psychiatric evaluation, by a good psychiatrist, to make sure that there isn't something like bipolar disorder. For instance, exercise doesn't help people with bipolar depression as much as it does those with unipolar. So when people just have regular depression, exercise can have exercising for 25 minutes 3 times a week is equal or better to taking a medicine like Prozac daily. Wow. So, but it's not that much exercise really. It's essentially every other day. Probably, with sprints, it's even more effective. So, because it seems that the thing in terms of neurochemicals that really helps depression is this brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which exercise gives you, which causes, neuronal genesis, and seems to be associated with the antidepressant effect of antidepressants. But exercise gives you that, and sprinting gives you more. Yeah. So I think that there are these, things where for most people, treating it as a phobia of losing energy by doing things that take energy really does pay off. And the earlier they take that approach, the better.
Now, this seems to be kind of a common theme where we've talked about insomnia before. Insomnia is a phobia of insomnia. Anxiety can be seen as a phobia of anxiety. Depression, it sounds like you're saying, is a phobia of depression.
Yeah, exactly. So these things are like self-fulfilling prophecies. Okay. Yeah, they're self-fulfilling prophecies.
And that's the nature of the vicious cycle.
It is.
Okay.
That the very things people are doing are making it worse.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, and then do these things, are they more effective as treatments for depression, or are they also preventive of depression?
Yeah, both.
Okay.
So in general, the things that treat depression also prevent depression.
Mm-hmm.
Sonia Demigian had this fantastic study in 2008 on behavioral therapy, where she compared, this is just to mention, doing cognitive therapy for depression, which is you work through the thoughts and the distortions in thoughts to help people have a more balanced way of approaching problems in life,
Okay.
versus just focusing on behaviors and getting people more active in relationships and exercise, these things. And they found that the just behavioral approach worked better than the cognitive approach, even at treating distortions in thinking. So that the thinking became clearer in people who just got more active. So in my mind, that was a very important study, showing that this is a behavioral issue. And depression is a great example of something that is biobehavioral. It has a biological result in that their thinking does become slowed down. The negative processing bias becomes more severe. Their attention tends to stay in their default mode instead of task attention. There are all these measurable effects, but driven by behavior. So changing the behavior for the vast, vast majority of people is the very simplest and best way of treating the depression.
That's awesome. So if we could just summarize those behaviors before we finish up. So we have the 3 from the article: confiding in others, no napping, 0,
Exactly.
and I guess reducing TV, especially probably during the day, right? And then you also had added exercise to that.
Yeah, and the same authors have other things on exercise.
Yeah,
they had studies designed to look at that, showing that increased activity, particularly vigorous exercise. Mm-hmm. So things that get your BDNF out. So very intense exercise does that.
Okay, and then we also talked about the importance of working better, learning how to work better. Yeah. And would there be any other major activities that you would add to that? I mean, it does,
in a way, changing their approach to work does everything, because all of cognitive therapy, which we know works for depression, ultimately comes down to reframing. So if you can reframe the task you're about to do, seeing as an opportunity instead of as a threat, that becomes even more powerful for people facing depression, because the work looks more like a threat.
Yeah.
So if they practice reframing the next hour of work, it actually is like cognitive therapy. And then mindfulness also is helpful, for depression. And there is good data on mindfulness helping with depression. Actually, there's just a study that came out that said, maybe mindfulness makes people more anxious or depressed. And in this study, they found that 8% of people who practice mindfulness end up having an unwanted experience. And so, which, I think mindfulness actually does have really good evidence, when it comes to treating some of these things. But if you just use this idea that it's like saying 8% of people who go running have an unwanted experience because they get sore.
Yeah.
But sometimes that is really the growth taking place. Right. And so it's not necessarily a bad sign. And so I don't think silence is dangerous to mental health. So just, being silent, if you've been worrying about a lot, you can actually then get initially a little more flooded with worrying. Right. People have to learn how to handle that, but it doesn't mean don't do silence. So it's like, no, this is something you'll have to work through in the first sessions of doing it. But gradually it does calm down. And people who are depressed tend to ruminate, just repeatedly dwelling on the past. Sometimes they worry also about the future. And so what can happen is that their thoughts are just churning in their imagination all the time. Well, mindfulness gets them into reality, back into the here and now, and then allows them to get their attention kind of hooked in the present and then engaged in work. So the mindfulness part of a golden hour also is really helpful at stopping ruminating and getting people engaged. And the last part of setting a challenge, well, that's more the essence of it. Yeah. And so to really embrace the work and to set up the path you're going to do, steps that are challenging, That's like behavioral activation in a nutshell. So I think that the golden hour actually does address the deepest needs. And so my dream is that someday we'll actually have data, you know,
Right.
and we're not doing like a psychiatric treatment here with OptimalWork, but the principles we're using are powerful. And hopefully we could show in time that it does prevent things. So, but for that, we'll have to stay tuned.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that's it for this week. Kevin, we're all done. So
All right, Sharif,
we'll be
thanks.
back next Monday.
Great. Take care.
All right. Thanks so much.